Good morning again. I am sure most of you know who I am, Maxine McLean, and I will be chairing this morning's first workshop or session. And as I did say in my welcoming remarks, one of the important aspects of diaspora engagement is engaging our wider diaspora. And that obviously for Barbados, a major aspect of our wider diaspora is the continent of Africa. And doing business in Africa, therefore, is an obvious opportunity for Barbadians at home and Barbadians abroad. As your booklet says, the countries of Africa, and I would stress particularly Sub-Saharan Africa from our perspective, those countries offer significant commercial and other opportunities for the Barbadian diaspora. I spoke in another forum where I was promoting this event on the possibility of triangular engagement, that is Barbadians at home, Barbadians in the areas that we traditionally have been, and Barbadians and our friends in and on the continent. And therefore with me are three very distinguished panelists to share with you a number of perspectives. One, of course, has to do with the context, the rules and policies that can support or hinder our involvement in doing business in Africa. And therefore, I am very pleased to have with me Ms. Lisa Cummins, who's the Executive Director of the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries Limited. Lisa is a former Foreign Service Officer, and I will not attempt to fully present her biography because we have already started late, and if I did that for each of these, that in itself is a very powerful story to tell. But currently, as I say, she's Executive Director, having been for a number of years, 10 years, a Foreign Service Officer with the Barbados Ministry of Foreign Affairs. During her tenure as a Foreign Service Officer, she would have been seconded to work in Uganda as a consultant, first with the World Bank and then with the Commonwealth Secretariat. Among her areas of specialty would have been trade policy. I also have with me a face that is known to many because you would have seen her on CBC on many occasions in another life, Dr. Donna Hill, who is a Development Finance Advisor and Executive Director of Equity Strategies International, consultants on global corporate responsibility, development, and economic governance, and most importantly, in the context of today, innovative investment strategies. She's also founder of Investors for Development, I4D, an initiative to harness international capital markets to create development and prosperity through sustainable profit. And I could go on. And I am particularly pleased to have with us Mr. Hakeem Belo-Osagie. Mr. Belo-Osagie is a Nigerian and extremely successful, quite humble from my involvement with him, extremely successful businessman. I say if you want to know how successful, Google the name and come back and tell me what you found. He holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School, a law degree from Cambridge University, and an MA in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University. In the US, they talk about Ivy League schools. We know what Oxford signifies in the context of the UK. He's a member of the Nigerian Bar. He started his career as a petroleum economist and as a lawyer. And for over 3 decades, he has been a key player in the Nigerian economy through his participation in several businesses in the private sector, particularly in energy, finance, and telecommunications. He would have been employed by the federal government of Nigeria in a number of capacities in the energy sector, including Secretary of the Oil Policy Review and LNG committees. So for those persons who have been discussing LNG in the context of CARICOM, we know somebody to whom we can speak. He is a past chairman of the board of directors of the United Bank for Africa PLC, one of the largest commercial banks in Nigeria. And I can tell you that I saw the diaspora in motion just now when I saw him talking to Mr. David Cutting, a Barbadian who is home for the conference, but who has had a long and distinguished career in banking in Africa. And so they know each other quite well. I could go on to speak of his past experiences, but he's currently the chairman of the board of directors of Emerging Markets Telecommunications Services Limited, a mobile telephone operator, which operates in Nigeria on the Etisalat, that's right, brand, and he was recently appointed as a member of the global board of advisors to the Council on Foreign Relations, the preeminent independent non-partisan think tank in America. And I believe those words signal to you how impressive a panel we have. I will first call on Ms. Lisa Cummins, and before I do that, I will just say that we will have the 3 presentations, and on completion of those presentations, you can raise questions, and therefore, as the presentations are made, you can make note of your questions and comments. But what I do not want in terms of comments are long treaties or discourses. I had many years of teaching, so I know how to pull students into order. So I will now call on Ms. Cummins. Lisa?
Thank you very much, Minister. It's definitely a pleasure to have been invited to sit on this panel with the other panelists who are here, in particular Dr. St. Hill and our colleague who's joined us all the way from Nigeria. Now, my comments are going to place in context a couple of things that will come a little later. They're going to speak to a couple of very basic issues on doing business with Africa. One, I want to start out with the basic premise that the media has done doing business with Africa a great disservice. Very often what we see depicted of the African continent and the multiple countries there and the culture of doing business is not necessarily fully reflective of the reality of doing business in Africa, and that has created an opportunity for many of us to avoid the continent and avoid doing business in a way that would actually be far more beneficial than we would have imagined had we taken the opportunity to go forward. The second thing that I want to deal with is the question of multicultural diversity. We have a notion very often that Africa is almost a homogeneous place, when the reality of it is that it is the entirely opposite. For me, the experiences that I would have had in Southern Africa are very different from those that I've had in Western Africa, those that I've had in East Africa. And while there are common threads that unite them all, there are some very strong differences. The third thing I want to major on, and I spend time getting into my comments, is the environment for creating opportunities for trade. Here in the Caribbean, specifically here in Barbados, we've had a very recent discussion in Parliament, and I know it's preparing to go up to the other levels, on the utilization of trading agreements and the climate for doing business in terms of our ACP relationships. We've had a long discourse about the relationship between CARICOM, by extension CARIFORUM, and the African countries and the European countries, and our failure to utilize those agreements. But one of the things that we've not discussed as extensively as we ought to is the inter-ACP relationships, the South-South relationships that exist through the ongoing construct of the ACP, and how best we can utilize those South-South relationships to generate new business, to create partnerships, and to engage in trading relationships. And I want to focus on those things. But I want to start first by talking a little bit about the notion of multicultural diversity in terms of our own perceptions of how African countries, I'm going to be very general in my initial comments, and then I'll become more specific as I go along. Our own approaches to doing business in African cultural countries needs to be transformed. And I'm going to tell you a very personal story, a personal experience from my first few months being in an African country and being responsible for negotiating one section of their trade agreements with, at the time, I was their lead advisor on services in the East African community, and here in the CARICOM region, we'd already concluded our own CSME arrangements, and they were attempting to replicate that in East Africa. And so here was this Barbadian very hot commodity, because they wanted to know what we've done and how we've done it, because they wanted to replicate it. And that became another very practical export of our South-South relationships to technical assistance. But internationally, multilaterally in the WTO, I found myself in a position where I was responsible for negotiating the trading relationships of East African bloc with the rest of the world and representing their interests. And multicultural diversity then in all of those various arenas became an important reality for me. And many times when we are sitting across from African business people, we're in the WTO, we're in various fora, UN and so on, and we hear African countries speaking, sometimes it's very removed from our own reality, and sometimes unless we're immersed in it, we don't understand it. So I'm going to give you a very brief story to contextualize what I mean by multicultural diversity and how that has impacted on the way in which different countries do business and how they identify priorities. So in the first week or so that I was based in Uganda, I was on my way to an East African community meeting. I was driving with a colleague, and the elevator on my floor had a very ugly habit of opening and closing very quickly. And so I learned in just a couple of days you have to dart in quickly before it closes in order to get in. So I did that, and as I got into the elevator, there was a man standing in the lift, and he had under his arm a live chicken. Now, my reality from Barbados was that there was no reason for a live chicken being in an elevator in a business, so I ran back out screeching. Everybody came out on that corridor. What is wrong with this Mzungu? Because that's what they used to call me, this Mzungu. What is wrong with this woman? What is the matter with her? Anyhow, I composed myself. I got back into the lift and was convinced this thing was part of some ritual. I couldn't understand what this thing meant. A little later on down in the week, I was walking by the minister's office. The minister's office, and outside of the minister's office, there was a man sitting, and on his lap, like a toddler, he had a live chicken. I thought, no, what is going on? Then a couple of days later, I was driving on the highway. We were heading up to Kenya, and there was what they call a matatu, which looks like a ZR van. On top of this thing, all I could see were wings flapping. Live chickens strapped to the top of this thing. And when I would tell my colleagues in Barbados what I was seeing, they thought I was making these stories up. So I started to walk around with my camera, because I had to capture these live chickens. But I came to understand that I was living in a country where there was only 30% electrification. Most people prioritized fresh produce. We go into the supermarket and we shop in the supermarket. But they didn't prioritize that. They wanted it fresh. It was also a part of their way of welcoming visitors to their home, for example. So they bring you a live chicken. That was their way of saying you are welcome. You are welcome, my sister, you are welcome, my brother. And they presented you with this live chicken, and then they cook it. And that was their way of prioritizing that which was fresh. So imagine my stunned surprise when we then found ourselves negotiating sanitary and phytosanitary arrangements in the context of a trade agreement. And you have that on one hand, and you have to reconcile that with the fact that the Europeans, when trading with these countries, simply have very different standards for one killing of poultry, how it's maintained, how it's sold, how it's retailed, and those kinds of things. You also understood that because you could kill poultry in your homes and in your yards at home, and that was normal. Abattoirs and those kinds of things were, in many instances, depending on the area in which we were coming from, something that was very different. So multicultural diversity and multicultural sensitivity became a very important thing in understanding the perspective of different countries when dealing with it, because for them they prioritized fresh produce, and that was just Uganda. And so I had to learn how to then take that experience and translate it when working with farmers, when working with poultry producers, when working with the various meat associations, who then needed to understand the correlation between exporting of produce, particularly meat and poultry products, and how those standards in different countries needed to correspond with what was being done in the domestic, from farm to fork principle. So very simple things help you at times to understand the priorities of different countries and the environment within which you function. So I'm just putting that story out there first, because very often we don't see that aspect of it, and we think that when we hear different countries coming with different positions that don't reflect what is our reality, we a lot of times rubbish it, and we don't give it the credence that it actually requires. So that's my starting point in terms of the need for multicultural sensitivity. The second part of it that I want to focus on is this. Having understood the culture in which you work, it means that you have to understand multiple different levels. I want to focus on four main things. There's a need for perspective. What is your perspective on doing business with African countries? Barbados has historically, certainly from my time in the Foreign Service, we prioritize southern cone countries. We prioritize them because we identified that they had priorities that were similar to ours, that they were the more advanced countries. We had particularly strong relationships with Botswana in particular, and we were moving aggressively to look at South Africa. And then we had as our second wave, West Africa, starting first of all with Ghana. But perspective changes, and over time economies will transform. I believe that Minister in the opening remarks today spoke about Nigeria, I think it was the Prime Minister who said it, Nigeria rapidly preparing itself to overtake South Africa as the fastest growing African state. And they have. So perspective has to not necessarily be static, but it has to evolve. And so while our priority historically has been on the southern cone countries, there is a massive opportunity for us to pursue opportunities with those West African countries, Nigeria and Ghana in particular. And then if we move a little further into the central West African zone, we're looking at countries like Cameroon and so on. Planning. In order to get into an African market, many countries in Barbados, many countries around the region, around the world, they identify what they perceive to be opportunities. But remember, I started out by talking about multicultural diversity, multicultural sensitivity. Top-down planning to get into these markets is very often a mistake. You have to understand your market, you have to understand what the demands of the market are. You know that, say for example, if you're going into certain regions within a given country, I, for example, would not even contemplate the thought of buying a live chicken and taking it home with feed to feed it until I'm ready to use it. I am going to go into the supermarket and purchase it on a tray. But a large percentage of that demographic is not going to do that. So you have to understand who you're catering to, the regions within which they're operating, and what their purchasing capacity is, which in some instances is considerable. Partnerships. Why are partnerships necessary? Africa is an interesting place in terms of the need to create relationships with a range of local partners. Local government, central governments, in some cases federal government relationships, local business organizations, and of course business people who are well connected in the community. So partnerships become essential. You have to be able to forge critical partnerships. And then the final part of that is the people in those partnerships. As you deal with partnerships and you deal with people, there are two things that I would want to recommend. One, that you balance what the media has said about doing business in Africa and what the projections are of Africa with what you actually discovered through the forging of those partnerships. There was a study which was done by the World Bank and by the Doing Business Indicators where they assessed risk of doing business in different African countries, and they looked at different countries and where you could balance what they call balancing risk against opportunity. And it was an interesting study. It threw into clear focus some of the misnomers that have been put out there by the media. So I'm going to just very briefly talk about this. South Africa scored very highly in this matrix produced by the World Bank, and they said they have a lower risk in terms of perception, but a higher reward. We typically in Barbados talk about relationships with countries like Mauritius, but when they looked at Mauritius, they identified that Mauritius, while more closely aligned with what we here in the region would do, you have a lower risk, but also a lower reward. Interestingly, countries in West Africa balance the scale out between higher risk but also higher reward. So you have countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Morocco, you had in East Africa, Kenya, Southern Africa, Zambia, you had Tunisia, and of course Ghana, and the Singapore giant of East Africa, Rwanda. Those are countries that we in Barbados have not typically thought of doing a lot of business with, but they've presented tremendous opportunities for business people from around the world. In the short time, in the 3 years that I was there, you had massive investment flows. And these countries were chosen because they're the countries that are receiving the highest levels of foreign direct investment, either through direct investment in businesses or through direct investment in capital infrastructure projects. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that you had some countries, in terms of what was being represented in the media, being looked at as having very unstable environments. One of the things that I wanted to point out here is that in the case of Nigeria, for example, we have a lot of information, especially now, out there about what's happening in Nigeria, but it presents tremendous opportunity for doing business when you use the right partnerships. And I just wanted to focus on that. In closing, I want to say the following. Barbados has a range of sectors that are doing quite well and have the opportunity to do even more. We have, in terms of our regional integration arrangements, we have partnerships that can be created first within CARICOM to build economies of scale and then built on to advance into other markets like on the African continent. You have opportunities where, particularly in terms of renewable energy, we've seen businesses moving from Barbados into Nigeria. I believe it was Aquasol several years ago, and you have opportunities to advance that. And I would want to see in the services sector, I can't exclude that, Africa as a continent is importing on an annual basis over $502 billion in services, and they're doing it predominantly from developed markets. There is an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity, for Barbadian service providers to partner with partners on the African continent and in specific countries to export Barbadian services and thereon and furthermore Barbadian goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that you have put a pretty good context in terms of factors to consider. I will now turn to Dr. Hill, who has been living and working, I would say, pretty much at two ends of the continent. Dr. Hill.
Thank you, Senator McLean, and good morning, everyone. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and especially honored and excited to be talking about the Africa that I know and live in, and to meet my sister who was living next door, I don't know if at the same time, and to hear some of her personal reflections. So before I start, in terms of giving you some reflections, you know, they say a picture, it tells 1,000 words. I want to show some pictures of Africa and to set up for you the vision that we live. Can you make it bigger? Thank you very much. This is Africa. And this, I was just saying to Senator McLean, my staff put this together in the middle of the night because I thought the most important thing is to really give you some idea of my experience. You know, when you land in a place like Lagos, it is a feeling of excitement no matter how many times you go there. The possibility of what can be done is endless. And that is the energy of Africa today. So I want you to, I wanted to start with this to sort of put out of your mind the last set of images that you have of war and famine, and to show you happy Africa, optimistic Africa, people on the move, and the scale of how things are done and what is possible. You see the size of farms, you see the size of the cities, of the buildings, and so on. So that is the Africa that we want to introduce you to, and that is the Africa that I think, in terms of Barbados and in terms of creating a path to growth, is a really important possibility to start considering seriously. One, I just jotted down some points because Lisa has already given you some context. She's talked about numbers. I've shown you some pictures about scale. Hakeem will do some other more specific suggestions, ideas, and his own reflections, having spent the last week in Barbados sampling some of what we have to offer the continent. So I have a couple of points I want to make in sort of 2-3 points about why we should be doing this, and some guidelines that I think from my own experiences of doing business there. And two, then the issue of, somebody said it earlier, it is what we have done and how we have done it that is fascinating to the people that I've worked with. I advise a number of heads of state across Africa. When I talk to them about the Barbados model of development, they're all in a stage where, how should I say, it's an embarrassment of riches. They're making all this money, but it is unequal. And it is, how do we get the society that you have created? You can't have that society unless it is diverse, and you can't diverse your economy unless you have a wide swathe of people, well educated, to take advantage of all the opportunities that are coming. So the first thing I want to say, we have had our eyes firmly fixed on the UK and the US, Europe, for obvious reasons. These days we're looking at China for new reasons. But I mean, these are all important relationships. They're not going to be relationships of equals, not for a long time. In Africa, and doing business, I should say, with African countries, you're approximating a relationship of equals. They're bigger than you, and yes, some of them are very powerful. Nigeria, the most powerful black country on the continent. But we have an unbeatable advantage that even the Europeans don't have, the Chinese don't have, in terms of what we have done and how we have done it. Africans are now, those countries after their economic recession, have balance sheets that are the envy of the developed world. And they want to spend this money now to create change. We don't know in 20 years what they will have, but they know that if they don't use that money to make a transformation across the continent, then at the end of that 20 years, we're back where we started. So that's something I want to put in everyone's head. It is what we have to sell is what we have done and how we have done it. The timing is another point. Because Africa is booming, this is another reason. This is the time. It would have been difficult to think about engaging when some of the pictures of famine and war and so you were seeing were the reality in too many places. Right now, of 54 countries, most are at peace. Even the South Africa, which we were very much involved, as Barbadians and in the Caribbean, in helping to bring down apartheid from our music to our politics and so on in the international institutions. Africa is booming. Unless you've been under a rock, you know that 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa, must be half in, or nearly half in West Africa. We're our closest, brothers and sisters. Right now, this week, yesterday, and I think today, President Obama has invited all the African heads of state to meet with him for the first summit. And what they're trying to do is to capitalize on Africa's growth, catch up with the Chinese. If you want to know where the Chinese are interested in for serious business, look to Africa. That's where Chinese money is going, not aid. And you need not aid, you need investment to be on a growth strategy. Aid is not going to, it's not going to be our salvation. The World Economic Forum for Africa was just held in Abuja, Nigeria, at the time when you would have been all watching, because there was a story of the girls and all this and bombs, one near Abuja, others in the north of the country, and so on. Although most of Nigeria is at peace, this was important and everyone was focused there. But I'll tell you, if you paid attention, you will see that Russia, trying to have its own World Economic Forum 2 or 3 weeks later, could not stop the hemorrhaging of global CEOs. In Africa, people were willing to come because all the African serious businesses were going to be in that place, all heads of state of African countries too, to do the biggest deals that can be found anywhere, and as you say, the greatest return on investment. You would look to the IFC, don't ask me, who collect this data and can tell you that that's where if you put your money in there, you're successful, you'll make much more than if you had a successful business in America, Asia, anywhere else, really now on the planet. And then the timing also, the African Union has designated the Diaspora the 6th region of Africa. And that is, we have North, South, East, West, and Central Africa, and we're the 6th. So that is, again, for the timing, something we really need to think about capitalizing on. Jamaica has started, they have an ambassador to the African Union. So, this thing in Washington with Obama this week, I kept thinking how we are completely left out, and we would have had good reason, as whole countries. We're not diaspora as in people of African descent living in Canada, whole countries would have had a good reason structurally to be part of those discussions, even to be there in some form, to be meeting with those the power brokers there. And then you talked a little bit about it, Lisa, the idea of risk, that we need to, I know Barbadians are not necessarily risk takers, but I'm glad that some of these stalwarts of business I see here have stayed behind. The people who are seriously, they are entrepreneurs. Yeah, we'll think about ways how they can manage that risk. There are products to mitigate, if you're doing seriously large transactions, the World Bank has something, and most of the development banks do, because everybody is looking to go there, and yes, also thinking about risk and so on. So those products exist. But also, if there's no risk, there's no reward. I have tried to get some Barbadians interested. There are people that I knew, that I grew up with. I wanted to involve them in the businesses we're doing. They say, when I see the money in the bank, I will start to work. So we know we cannot work with that person. But that is a common mindset. If you're prospecting for business, you've got to put something in. You can't just get something back out for nothing. And that's something that I found not one person, but happened several times. So we have to really reevaluate our relationship to risk and see how being completely averse to risk is helping us to pay the mortgage, is helping us to get out of the recession, and really see whether our ideas of risk are serving us well. When I think about people like, even individuals, I hate to call the man's name that starts with S, who is an American, who knocked off whole percentages off of people's GDP with his Ponzi schemes and so on, but we don't write off Americans. And no Nigerian or Ghanaian or Botswana has done anything, like that. Then they look at the scale of what these people have done, the global financial crisis. None of this came out of Africa. And so we really need to ask ourselves, what is that about? that the people that cause us risk destabilize our economy, destabilize our children's lives and their future. We now have to pay for our students to go to university. You know, think about who is giving you the risk and where risk really lies and where opportunity lies. And, you know, we can't write off, again, even a place like Nigeria, we're talking about 200 million people because some people came from West Africa and could not get a plane flight back. So, I mean, I am doing a project where we're bringing 150 students to be trained because that head of state liked what he heard about Barbados, what we have done and how we have done it. And he's thinking how best to spend his money to create a legacy, not just as a politician, they're interested in that, but to see that his people are on that he has been the one to set them on a path to getting some of the outcomes that we see in Barbados, human development, education. So why I'm going to talk some more about that, but you know, we are sometimes too hard on ourselves because what we have may not be saleable to Europe. We don't recognize it's a commodity. It can be commercialized, and there's great demand for it. So let me talk about what we've done and how we will do it. So one, I think I talked a little bit about it, what we have to offer. From my own perspective, I come as a development practitioner. So I have a business, but I am, you know, so grateful and excited every day to be working in Africa. I am dancing in the streets. I can do the things that I want to do. I have an enormous scale. I have people who are interested in what I have to sell. And precisely because I am from Barbados, they're hearing something different. They like what they're hearing, and you know, you can get a check for that. So in terms of our strong public sector, that's something both individually, you were seconded, we could use thousands more like this. When you see people toying in South Africa on TV where I live, it is usually because, you know, they've got money for infrastructure in the trillions they cannot spend because they literally don't have enough good public service to get the money out the door. They don't have the accountants, the financial people, all these skills. They don't have, I mean, people will be rioting in the street because for 3 days they can't get water. So you would probably be doing the same too. Electricity is going up. And government has money, but it's not simply a matter of going and putting it in a bucket and people, you know, you have to, it has to be institutionally there, the implementation process, the capacity to implement this, the accountants, the engineers, this is what's missing. And I tell this story all the time of Angola, second biggest oil producer, second or third wealthiest country in Africa. They're Portuguese speaking. But the Cubans were able to come to their aid. They needed to build some strategic infrastructure, something like 11 bridges. Cuba was able to send them 12,000 engineers. They have their bridges. So think about your 3,000 public servants who just got laid off and how they could have been snapped up all over Africa that is dying for public sector people in all manner of different countries, many of them speaking English. So public health, the whole thing about diversification from commodities-based economy to a diversified, you know, leading on services. People will want to buy that. That's public service. And then on the manufacturing, Lisa did talk about the fact, the scale, you will need to make your partnerships. You have to come, you need 3 Pine Hill dairies to make a difference even in one small state of one country. But indeed, when I see Pine Hill going through its difficulties, it hurts me. Because I don't think there are 5 milk farms in Ghana doesn't have milk. But I am involved with somebody who's coming tomorrow. This evening, we're doing a milk factory. So he's very interested in looking at Pine Hill products. He can't believe he tasted some of these things, and we have the same taste. So instead of buying it from Germany and adapting it for the local audience, you can get those recipes through a joint venture with these people, and have and take these to market. I think Grace Foods of Jamaica, I saw, is doing, just in South Africa alone, in about 2 or 3 provinces, they're working $5 billion a year in 2010, and I know they've moved on from that. They're in Ghana, they're in Nigeria. That's about our whole GDP. Okay? All right. So financial services, all the rest of it. You saw some of this, and I think Hakeem will talk about this. So for ordinary people, things like the credit unions, so the middle class, and places like Nigeria, there's no real mortgage market. These are institutional developments that we can help with that will have a big payoff for us, and people who have the skills. And then on the high net worth, which is also growing, this low tax jurisdiction and other things, including tourism. I was at talking to the manager of the Hilton the other day, who was telling me about this growing, where I told him where I lived and so on. Growing African, thing he's interested in, because there was a big wedding. Most people stayed on the West Coast. Who couldn't fit in Sandy Lane? He had the overflow. This is 80 Nigerians. So, the British will get married, they will come, they'll have maybe 10 or 20 people. Half of them might not be able to come because of the tax thing at the airport that is 35 pounds. Right? And you have an entirely different approach where people want to come for your 4 seasons, book out the entire hotel, bring 200 friends, and that's how they roll. And we don't try to even tap that market. But I don't want to go on too long about that. Agriculture, something we know a lot about. The low tech, the high tech. I've noticed that sugar is also going to be, importation of sugar is ending in Nigeria next year. I know there's an opportunity for us there. Who knows more about sugar? Production, the byproducts, the green products out of it, the energy producing things and all that. And then of course culture. My Nigerian friends were very enthusiastic about all aspects of the carnival. A lot of it is because it feels like home. Now they're flocking to go to Dubai to spend, I don't know, 2 or 3 times the average Nigerian with money is going to be going there every year to shop, to relax and so on. If they knew about Barbados, similar weather, similar music, food they recognize. None of this they can get in Dubai. None of this they can get in Florida. Ghanaians, all these people will be here in droves. And the fact there's no visa is also, people can just get up and go the next day. So let me just stop here so that I can give my last colleague some time to talk and to also have time for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that was extremely useful, particularly the visuals that went before. And of course, I will not hesitate to say that we've saved the best to last. Ladies will accept that. Hakeem, over to you.
Honourable Minister, it is said that the first 3 impressions of a country, which define your relationship with a country, come when, first, what happens at the airport when you fly in. Secondly, what happens in your hotel and how you are treated by the most junior person in the hotel. And then thirdly, what happens at the very first party you attend. I do want you to know that the 16 of us who came from Nigeria had a warm, excellent reception at the airport, far better than we get in Lagos airport. Secondly, we have been exceptionally well treated in the hotel that we're staying at by the most junior members of staff. And thirdly, we all had a very great party. It has therefore taken me just 5 days to become a fan of Barbados. Now, we all look at each other through a certain worldview that is largely shaped by Western media. Just as a lot of Africans look at what we call the West Indies as a group of people who are smiling and dancing to calypso music all the time. So you look upon us as a group of people who are suffering from poverty, disease, famine, etc., etc. And these false perceptions of each other blind us to a unique reality. And what I like about this occasion, and why I salute very much people like Dave Cummins and Donna St. Hills, is because they have taken away these false perceptions. They have gone in at the deep end, and they're living examples of what we're talking about now can be done within Africa. Now, there is some truth, to be frank with you, in some of the old perceptions. And it comes from the fact that after independence, most African countries followed a political and economic path that had the government dominating the economy and running the country. All young people in those days went to work in the government of our country. And we still, in many ways, had to sort out a lot of the ethnic issues, a lot of the income issues, boundary issues that were still there on independence. African countries on the whole did not do running state institutions and running state enterprises well. We didn't. That is a fact. And we, frankly speaking, ran a lot of those institutions were run into the ground. In many respects, in the first 25 years, a lot of the public educational institutions and the public health institutions all also failed. And I would say that the West Indies, or West Indian countries, did those things much better than we did. Now, sometime around 1990, 2000, I think most African countries started to rethink that whole strategy. And we started to say to ourselves, look, we don't do state institutions run the economy well. It is time for the government to get out of the economy and allow much more private enterprise and allow individuals to associate as they see fit and run large sections of the economy. And that just started about 15 years ago. 15 years ago, when I bought a bank in Nigeria, it was regarded as sheer madness. How can a single individual buy a bank? Now it is quite normal. Now, the growth rates that you see in African countries, and they're very good growth rates, stems largely from the fact that the government has now gone out of the economy substantially. We have stopped the obsession that we had before, which was that all the investment must be local, all participation must be local, and most African countries today are far more open to foreign investment, to working with non-Africans in a manner which allows them the freedom to participate fully. And my view is that that is what has largely been responsible for the very large growth rates that you see today. I think that when Africa gets its infrastructure right, you will see a second spate in growth rates, and they will then begin to approach the kinds of growth rates that you have seen in China. Now, in my view, it is this exit of an inefficient government from the economy that has opened the space for private business, and it is that that gives opportunities for people such as yourself to participate in the economy. So I want to share that with you just for you to know why this opportunity arises, to realize that it's a real opportunity, and to realize that it's an opportunity that is going to be there for a long time, that I do not see the state going back into the economy in most African countries because that model has been discredited. Now I'm not saying that that model is bad for all countries. For some countries it has worked well. You have a very good state pension scheme here, you have a good state insurance scheme here, and you don't spoil what is working well. But in Nigeria, for example, that method has failed, and we're all going the private route. So that opportunity is very much there. Now, how to exploit it? The first thing I think that is important is you must have a different mental attitude. And that mental attitude is very important. I find people that I've come across who come from Barbados or come from Jamaica or come from Trinidad tend to be very professionally skilled. There are no doubts about their academic abilities. They have often worked in very structured environments. They're very experienced, and they're very loyal to the organizations that they belong to, whether inside their own countries or when they have traveled. However, when you are working in a large emerging markets, you need to be willing to live with a certain degree of uncertainty. All right? You need to understand that you have a plan, but that plan must shift from time to time. You need to understand that you may have a business plan, but you may need to amend that business plan as circumstances change. And you must not have the feeling that once there's a need to amend that plan, that all disaster is happening and you need to take the next flight back to Barbados or back to New York. You need to also understand that you're operating in countries in which not all the data is available, and therefore you may have to have proxies for the detailed data that you think you need. You need to understand that you may often be chasing 2 or 3 different ideas or different proposals, and it's through trial and error that you will find out which one works best. Now, not everybody is that way inclined. I'm married, for example, to a lawyer in Ghana, from Ghana, and she thinks I'm crazy because she says that you seem to be able to live with a certain degree of uncertainty. Some folks like certainty. And however much the reward, at the end of the day, they would rather go low risk, low reward, and there's some folks who are willing to take slightly higher risk for a high reward. And what I do want to urge for those of you who want to come to Africa is that the high risk, high reward is not as bad as you think. The high risks are not as high as you think, and I urge you to go in that direction. There are three key issues that I tell people you need to succeed, and that three-legged stool I refer to is usually 1, skills, capital, and connections. And I speak to you very frankly. Most of you will have the skills, that is the precise technical managerial skills, or you will be representing a company that has those management skills that you want to bring to Africa. And there are a lot of you, that will be your starting point. You will need connections, because most African countries, personal connections are very important because they are not as structured as here. The less structured a place is, the more you need to know large numbers of people who can ease the way for you. But I do have to say something to you, and that is that for people who are from Barbados or Trinidad, St. Kitts, who come from other African countries as well, because you are regarded as culturally similar to those of us living in Africa, your ability to make friends, your ability to be part and parcel of the social network in which a lot of these connections are made is much easier than you think. I tell visiting businessmen to Nigeria, to tell them that work doesn't stop at 5 o'clock in the evening. You've got to go to the man's wedding, his daughter's wedding. You've got to go to church with him sometimes. Sometimes you've got to go to the mosque with the person. You've got to play with the person until he regards you as a friend. And then you discover a lot of leads from that, and you are part of the community, and you run your business in accordance with those relationships made. And I don't think that Bayesians have any problems in that, just seeing the way that you relate with each other and seeing your carnival over the last 1 week. A local partner is very important, and having a national, whatever country you're in, who you can work with, the most important thing about him is that he should be trustworthy. It's not so important that he be very, very important. He'd be a big shot, because sometimes a big shot is working with so many other people that he may not have the time for you. And therefore, sometimes a person who knows a few people, you're a high priority to him, may be a better partner. That partner is very important with you. And you've got to be willing to travel. When I say travel, please do not be one of those guys who shows up in Nairobi or Lagos on Tuesday, is very upset when his appointments are postponed by 2 or 3 days, needs to leave on Friday, and is very upset when he's not successful. You've got to be willing to extend your trips. You've got to be willing to spend time there, because things always take much longer than you expected. I'm sure you probably have Asian time here. We do have African time here, and it is part and parcel of business. Now, I'd just like to touch on one last thing before I round up and take your questions. And I want to go to this issue of political stability and risk. I gave a talk recently at MIT. And I was asked the question, we think Africa is very risky. And I responded and said the following, that the business schools in the world teach risk incorrectly, okay? Because when they refer to risk purely political risk. That is unscheduled changes of government, coup d'etats, etc., etc., etc. And I said, yes, it is true that for me as a businessman in Africa, I have a higher degree of risk that is political in nature, but my market risk or my technological risk in Africa is much lower. So for example, if I'm in any business in the West, say I'm a Citibank, I'm in the technology area, I can be blown out of the water if I'm, say, Nokia, by a product that Google makes, which I didn't realize was even in my section, and the sheer speed of technological change in the West can mean that that business is disrupted over a number of years. And I said to them that if you add on both technological risk, market risk, and political risk, and you take risk as a single whole, in my view, my risk is not as high as yours, because the first mover advantage that I have in Africa as being the first one into that particular area is very powerful, and it's likely that I'll remain the only player there, one of the few players there for a long, long time. I'm happy to tell you that they did agree with me. Whether or not they're going to stop teaching it in the wrong way, I don't know, but they did agree with me. I'd like to just confirm and agree with the statements made by the last two speakers about the opportunities I think in the hospitality industry, financial services industry, the sugar industry, and in the provision of services by others. And I just do, again, as further a way of encouraging you or to tell you that one of the biggest businesses in Africa, Western Union, for example, was brought by a Ghanaian to Nigeria, believe it or not. Some of the best innovations that have come into Nigeria in the IT business were brought along by an Ethiopian, for example. The first guys who got into Angola, for example, many, many years ago were Ghanaians and Senegalese. So I make all these statements just to show you that you do not have to be a national to succeed in a specific country. I look forward to seeing all of you at some point, at some airport, in some restaurant in Africa over the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I believe that we have 3 excellent presentations. The floor is now open. Recognizing that we are running late, we will have about 20 minutes or so of discussion so we can get it back on track as far as possible, but I think it's important that we have some discussion. The floor is open. You may say who you are. You may want to use the mic.
Good morning. 3 fantastic presentations. Thank you very much. I'm Timothy Boyce, and my company is Tourism Investment Management, Inc. We do real estate and investment opportunities in tourism. 3 quick questions. One for Lisa. Lisa mentioned that there are $5.2 billion in services. I would like you to expand a bit on those services. Dr. St. Hill, you mentioned very much that there is a tremendous amount of opportunity in Africa, and I would want you to expand on the tourism opportunities there. I know that Africans travel for much longer periods than Europeans, and the average spend by an African is tremendously higher. And they travel in groups and families. And I think Europe and North America, they've been benefiting tremendously from that level of African discretionary and disposable income. The question is, how do we in the Caribbean benefit from that. And I don't think it is going to be possible unless we have direct transportation between Africa and the Caribbean, and Africa is just 5 hours away from us. So I would want to see you hear a little expansion on that. And a question there for Hakeem. Hakeem, you obviously are a practical man in the business world, and I would love to have a little conversation with you outside of this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Lisa, you can respond first.
Thank you, Minister. It's interesting that Mary Simmons just walked in, because I was just mentioning her to Donna. I was saying to her that when I went to Uganda, the former head of UNDP in Nigeria was a Barbadian, and that she had been able, during her time there, to do an amazing number of projects that brought that cultural perspective to the work of UNDP in Nigeria, and she just walked in at the same time. So, hi Mary, welcome home. In terms of the sectors that are gaining traction in Africa, you have, of course, topping the list, huge investment in infrastructure services. Much of that infrastructure, much of those investments are coming from China. You have China investing very, very heavily in the area of infrastructure, simply because we've cited over many years that Africa has had challenges in that area, and they've come in and they're constructing roads, railways. They're I think, leading investment in the area of trade facilitation, investment, including ICT and technology. There are massive investments flowing in those areas, particularly coming from the Chinese. You also have financial services. You have a range of financial services that are not necessarily yet seeing themselves to develop capacity here in the region. So things like using your mobile phone to send money to your relatives in rural communities is a huge business in Africa, using the combination of technology services and financial services. You could send from, say, Kampala to your relative in Nairobi, using one of the telecommunications networks. You could send money, you could pay bills. They've also been able to develop market information systems, also using mobile technology, where you can share information about where there's a surplus in one rural area, about one given commodity, and what's happening in another. So you see those kinds of needs creating opportunities for exports and services. Hakeem spoke about the need for skills. So you have a huge number of professional skills also being exported to African countries to build that capacity, both in the public sector, but also in the private sector. You have countries that, particularly in those that were very heavily commodity-based, that are now making the transition to develop their own services capacities, importing very heavily those services that are needed to make that transformation from a commodity-based exporting country to a more diversified economy that incorporates services as incidental to agriculture and manufacturing, as well as services as standalone. Tourism services, of course, are huge. So I'm going to stop there and then pass on to my colleagues.
Very welcome. I think we're a small sisterhood in the sisterhood because we were all in the development organizations, and this is how we discovered Africa and grew to love it. But I think between you and I, Lisa, Barry, David, we can start creating the Barbadian Friends of Africa, for sure. We'll make our own crop over band next year. Right, the tourism question. Yes, I can't go on enough because both in terms of the investment opportunities, I see that place down there in the Four Seasons place on Paradise, again languishing, and I thought, has anybody opened that to Africans? Because Four Seasons is one of those places that people love to go on holiday, take over the whole place for their weddings, 40th birthdays, etc. And we need more than Sandy Day. If you're good to, again, you're talking about high net worth individuals who within 2 or 3 days, we had dinner one night at Hakeem's house. I told him, we had a discussion about sorrel, which I call sorrel. He calls it something else, he's called something else there. And when he learned that you can come there and have a holiday, you have similar food, these fufu, these fish, and these soups we call stews, and so on, He was within 3 days, he was writing with all his family and friends to say, we're coming, when is a good time to come, and let's plan the time. So that's the kind of response that you will get, but it's just a sad thing that we don't spend any effort trying to get them. Some trickle through, especially people who are close. They may have gone to school here in the U.S., they've met other West Indians, Caribbean people, so they have us in mind because they have that relationship. And as we were both saying, the tourism experience will lead to the business and the investment opportunity. Just like the Europeans, they come, they have such a wonderful time. The next thing you know, they've bought a villa, they're here for 30 years, every year they come once or twice, their children have grown up here, and I think we can certainly get that from Africans who are high net worth. Because a lot of working class Africans really cannot travel for a lot of reasons, but I think, yes, and it's far and all the rest of it. But people who have access to, the second biggest private jet market, I think, is Nigeria, fastest growing, the whole champagne thing and all that. So the fact that we have some good luxury names, we need more, because we will soon be at capacity if we actually invite these people. We don't have enough at that level. One or two good hotel and a handful of villas, it's going to be enough. But I'm heartened to see I had the opportunity for the first time, because every time I come, it's combining business with pleasure, and I got an opportunity. I had a weekend here. I went to Lime Grove. Again, Africans, a lot of people are making money for the first time. The way they spend is different from Europeans who've had money for 300 years. They have everything. You need 10 Rolexes with diamonds if you just, you have a mine somewhere, or you make your first deal. So when you come on holiday, they also want the luxury experience. That's a very important sector for Africa, and also something that's helping to drive the growth. The spend, I clipped it out and I forgot to put it, but the Financial Times, just over last weekend on my way traveling from London, I brought, I had the Weekend FT, and there were 2 very good articles about Africa. The second one I forget, I don't have it with me, but the first was about the spend. I think Saudi Arabia, the Arabs are the top spenders, but very close behind that is Nigerians, not just Africans, Nigerians. So, British will go to the shop, they will spend an average of 300, Nigerians will spend 3,000. So, again, we have limited money for marketing, and we need to be really thinking, where's the bang for the buck? And for the tourism, there's really no downside. We talk about luxury hotels, luxury shopping, transportation. Again, the sort of people who are going to be able to come, it is not backpacking, Australian kind of tourists, for many reasons, cannot come. If they can travel, they maybe go around Africa and so on. Their prime South African tourists, African tourists that can come, have, there are people who are going to the U.S. all the time, they're going to Britain, it's just a short stop. They go other further places. Once you come to New York, for example, for me it's if I come straight from Johannesburg, it's a 16-hour flight, but once I get to New York, it's 4 hours. So for people who are in those markets several times a year, that level of Nigeria, they're going to be traveling, the Ghanaians, the South Africans, so it is not so far-fetched. And quite a number of, especially the oil economies, Angola and so on, it's private jet. It's how they, deal with the issue of the transportation issue. So it is not as bad as you think. For the trade in goods now, we recognize that not having something more direct is a real challenge. I know that Prime Minister for Southeast Assar was thinking of some sort of direct route, and they've been talking about that for some time, with Caribbean Airways. If that happens, that would help a lot. But on the tourism side, I don't see the challenges that you expect. I'd say no. Transportation.
I'd just like to add a number of comments. I think that in terms of tourism, the issue for Barbados is more one that a lot of people need to know more about what the country has to offer. And I just would like to give myself as an example. I mean, the first time when I mentioned to Donna that my ambition was to go to a carnival in the West Indies, and I said that my plan is to go to Trinidad and Rio. And she replied that, why don't you try Barbados? Now, I didn't tell her this, but what was going on in my mind was, does Barbados have a carnival? I've never really heard about this. And I didn't tell her this either, so I asked my daughter to please just confirm this on the internet. And then the internet referred to this thing that was called crop over. So I now had to check whether crop over was the same thing as carnival. All right? And so here we are. And in fact, it was then that looking at the internet, I now realize that almost all the islands in the West Indies all have their celebrations. But the two that you get to hear about in West Africa tend to be Trinidad and Rio. That's what you hear about. And then when you think of tourism, the next place you think about is Jamaica, because there are two places you just hear about all the time. Ocho Rios, and then you think about Montego Bay. And I'm convinced that part of the reason for Montego Bay is that there's a song called Montego Bay that everybody has heard about, and therefore that's what you think about, and you feel that going outside of that is a problem. Just as, for example, when you think of safari, you think of Kenya, even though they're probably as interesting, if not more interesting, safaris in Tanzania, for example, but in your mind, Kenya is. So I think that a lot of the issue has to be publicity, marketing, so that people know, what you have to offer. I don't think that the distance is as much of a problem, because I genuinely think that people in a lot of African areas are used to traveling a great distance for places. I mean, people travel huge distances for destination weddings in Seychelles. They go to Thailand for these things, and I think they'll be willing to do so here. And the last comment I just want to leave you with is a comparison of two countries. One is Dubai and one is Bahrain. Now, when I was in university, people thought that the future place for international trade was going to be Bahrain. Nobody thought of Dubai. But Dubai, in 20 to 30 years, by concentrated work, made Dubai the central point of the Middle East. Today, nobody thinks of Bahrain. I think it's your challenge to make yourself that center for the West Indies.
I think Lisa wanted to make a point, and then I would want to raise a question in relation to transport.
I just wanted to make a comment very quickly on the question of goods and the shipment of goods to African countries, and the need for the notion that there is a need for direct air or shipping links. In Uganda, for example, there was a little supermarket that I found one day on an off chance. I found a can of Jamaican ginger beer. And I was very intrigued because I was seeing Angostura bitters coming out of Trinidad, I was seeing rum coming out of Jamaica, and then I saw this Jamaican ginger beer, and I made it a point to go and find the owner. But I found the manager first. He didn't know where it came from. And in my mind, because I'm thinking in the Barbadian context, I'm thinking, where is the closest place that potentially could have shipped this into Uganda and into East Africa more widely? And it turned out that it wasn't even South Africa. These things were coming through Dubai. Jamaica had created a distribution network that went from London through Dubai, and they were using that to ship goods into East Africa. So I wouldn't want us to leave here or to continue with the notion, because it's a misguided notion, that the absence of shipping links, either air or sea links, is a challenge to getting goods into the African continent, particularly those that other countries have proven quite successfully so that it can be done without that. I also want to go into a second point, which is with respect to Trinidad and crop over and so on. I think Mary will remember that Trinidad, through its High Commission in Nigeria, took a West African carnival to West Africa. They attempted to do the same thing in Uganda to create an East African carnival, so that you took the notion of crop over and carnival into those two regions at the time. I'm not sure if they're still alive and well, but those were initiatives that they sought to utilize to export culture. that included things like costume making and all of that kind of stuff, and they ship the stuff from Trinidad. So there are ways in which we can do this, and I really, really get concerned that we continue to labor under the notion that these things cannot be done because they're being done by other countries.
Thank you very much, and I think I saw the gentleman at the back first.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Buddy Laria, and I represent the Society for the Resettlement of Caribbean Nationals and also the Non-State Actors Reparation Commission. I would like to pick up on the last point that way. History has told us that transportation is very important. Don't underestimate it. The first direct flight from Africa to the Caribbean landed here in Barbados on the 1st of February 2008. And that caused tremendous difficulties for people who wanted to come here for a holiday. Because, as was said earlier, they did not need a visa. And the flight, this was a chartered flight, did not come back to take them up, and then they could not get back to Africa.
Mr. Lario, though, I want if you have a question. Remember, I did make the point that we have to keep it pretty short. So if you have a question,
so the question is,
thank you.
When are we going to have a direct flight to Africa? Secondly, because I said it's important. Secondly, I just want to comment on Dr. Sinhel's point. You give some information about Africa and the diaspora being the sixth reason. How many people in here know that next year starts the decade for people of African descent, which is critical for all that we are talking about. And finally, Hakeem, you mentioned the mine. Most Barbadians do not see themselves as Africans, and that takes into consideration...
Sir, I'm sorry, but as I said, we can't have speeches because you've raised about 3 things you want, and I'm not being rude, I am being practical because there's some others. You've asked about transportation and direct flight, etc. If you would, you can have some of these discussions outside because we also do not want, it is now 1:02, and we were supposed to finish our quarter to. So if you don't mind, if you could let them discuss that.
Yes.
And then we can talk about perceptions of who we are in a private situation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
What I will do is take the next question from Senator Adams, and then we will have some responses. Senator Adams.
Thank you, Senator McLean. Let me start by saying that Senator McLean recently said in the Senate that on her trip to Turkey, she actually saw, I don't know if she drank, Mount Gay Ram. And one of the points made in the area of trade was in agriculture. And we are in the process of revitalizing our sugar industry. I'm focusing on sugar. And not so much for the sale of sugar, but particularly in the area of production of molasses and the tertiary industry that comes from that is sugar cane. I mean, it is rum, and we have a rum, which is the Mount Gay rum, that's about the oldest rum in the world. What I want to ask is, to what extent is our rum known in Africa? And also our falernum, which is a unique Barbadian delicacy, and it goes with rum, and it's called corn and oil. And I would like to indicate here that out of this conference, some direct link and contact should be made with the ability to get our falernum and rum in Africa, given the fact that the European Union has has put aside sums of money for the marketing of our rum. And it carries the logo, which allows it to have international acceptance. So I think from a practical standpoint, that something concrete ought to come out of this conference in relation to our rum and falernum getting into Africa.
Thank you very much, but I certainly would not offer Hakeem a bottle of rum. But I think that Dr. St. Hill may want to speak. I think that's an important export for us. Is there anything you...
Well, I think you talked about it, the distinctions that our rum has. Oldest, I know we have some brands that have very high premium. Yes, you were talking about the distinctions of our rum being some of the oldest and so on. There's a whole history around it. I say to people, no, we're not so fascinated, I tell my English friends, by alcohol. We practically invented rum. And so we don't make a fool of ourselves over it. But as I say, in a market, again, Angola, the South Africans, Nigeria, very finely honed taste. They want the best of everything. And so if we promote that product, obviously it is already, but explaining to people that it is the, what is the top champagne now? Moet, of rums, that's your entry point. That's your entry point to the market, some of which I've mentioned. Remember, a lot of Africa is also Muslim, so it may not be drinking alcohol, but for those who do, that's why you can't say Africa. You have to actually think about, regions, countries, and think about your market. But by and large, people who will be able to afford that, the best way to pitch it, I would say, given what it is and what it will cost you to get it out there, to make it worth your while as a premium product. I don't know anything about direct linkages and so on. We can talk about that after. I know the IDC is looking at selling our products, in Africa, in African countries, looking at strategies and so on to help local producers. So they might come up with some more specific recommendations based on their own findings. But I think it would be something very worthwhile pursuing.
On rum, I think in my initial comments I said that we had to be very clear on multicultural diversity. Donna alluded to it when she spoke about the high Muslim concentration, but I think it also, as it relates to trade and markets, we have to understand consumer tastes. In East Africa, for example, you'll find a heavy concentration of people who have a preference for things like the gin, the waraji type thing, where they drink more gin-based products as opposed to rum. In West Africa, it may be different. In South Africa, it may be very different. And so you have to be very clear on which region and which country you're going into and how best to get that into it. I want to use the example of Trinidad in this instance because there's a way in which you can do it. In East Africa, you had high instances of people doing home brews and not being able to do it well, and people dying as a result of alcohol poisoning. There may be an opportunity for Barbados and Barbadian rum producers and so on to offer that by way of technical assistance to those countries as a way of starting first the introduction into the markets. Trinidad, for example, as a way of getting into the East African market, they set up a high commission in Kampala that services all of East Africa and the Middle East, and they're offering scholarships for persons to come from those countries in the oil production industries where there are now new discoveries of oil to come to University of Trinidad and Tobago to do petroleum engineering. So that is their way of getting different countries to take advantage of technical assistance first as a way of getting into the market. And rum may present a prime opportunity for us to do just that.
Thank you very much.
Just 2 or 3 comments. The first is that it is not necessary for Barbadians to see themselves as Africans in order for them to do business. It's not necessary. The only point I'm just making is that there are enough similarities, partly because of the common experience of a British colonialism, which means that a lot of our educational, our legal institutions are very similar. Okay? There has been enough contact between the various groups to make your experience of working in Africa very different from the experience of, say, a Japanese businessman, right, who is coming to a culture that is totally different. That's the only point I'm making. I can't comment on the issue of rum, but I think Donna and co have been. My last drink of alcohol was when I was 19 years of age. So my wife is Christian, so I leave the drinking to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Donna, quickly, and then...
Can I just beg the indulgence on that, seeing ourselves as African? And if we don't see ourselves as African, this is just a symptom of the enormous damage that has been done to our psyche. Because what else? We're not Chinese. And we're never going to become Japanese or some other thing. We'll always be African. We're not Indian, exactly. And those Chinese that went to build the railroads, how many hundred years ago in America, what are they today? They're Chinese. Thank you.
David?
Minister, thank you very much. I wanted to, in support of what the panel has been trying to achieve, and that is to paint the picture that Africa is open for business and that there's tremendous opportunity. But as somebody who has benefited from having worked in Africa for 10 years, my first assignment was running an international bank in Nigeria. I had the good fortune of meeting Hakeem and his family and the extended Belo-Osagie family. And part of the success I had is, I think I was the first black CEO for Standard Chartered Bank in Nigeria. I had the advantage of this family helping me to bridge the gap between the culture from which I came and the one I was inheriting. And what I learned in Nigeria for the 3 years I was there, I was able to take with me to Uganda and then to Botswana. And what I would like to say for those people who are considering investment opportunities in Africa is just go for it. I spent a significant amount of time trying to sell the opportunity in Nigeria to my bank. When I went to Nigeria in 2000, Standard Chartered, as you remember, were not all that aggressive and keen. Today, that business is Standard Chartered's largest bank in Africa. They've got over 30 branches. When I left, they had 4 branches, and they're doing extremely well. And you can say the same thing about East Africa. You can say the same thing about Southern Africa. So I represent a Barbadian example of somebody who went to Africa knowing very little, and I've left knowing quite a lot, very convinced about the opportunity there, but I would say to you, don't be discouraged by media perceptions of Africa. I have lived it, and it's been a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I will take 2 more. There's a lady, and we've had no females, and then Mr. Gibbs, and then we will have to wrap up.
Okay, good morning. I'm Maureen Pollard, and I'm with the Human Resource Development Strategy. I particularly want to look at the area of human resource development, and we've already started an initiative with some Africans who came here. We recently assisted with the Inter-African Academy of Business Development. They had a conference here in Barbados, hosted a conference. And out of that, it was felt that there are enough similarities in terms of culture that at the university here, for example, we are trained based on Western models of business development. And it was felt that because the cultures are similar, we need to look more at African models of business development. And we specifically want to look at the growth of the film industry, for example, Nollywood. We are looking at models in terms of setting up demo farms and things like that. So I want to ask, I don't have your full name, but Hakeem, if he could share with, especially given your background with Harvard University, the importance of looking to the African diaspora for human resource development.
I can only agree with you, and I think that one of the things that you will find happening more and more in Africa right now is that a lot of companies are looking for people like David, that is people who are Africans or of African descent who have been abroad because they, in many senses, have a shorter distance to travel in getting used to the countries that they are working in, and they have done very well. I don't know why I forgot, but I clearly forgot that that one of my top finance guys in the telecoms company I run actually spent the last 10 years working for Digicel in Barbados. I completely forgot that has happened, but that's happening more and more and more. There was a time, and I think I must be frank in sharing this with you, where there was almost a bit of jealousy of Nigerians, East Africans or West Indians or Jamaicans who were abroad, who came back and had expatriate salaries. And the guys who had remained in Nigeria for a period resented it. And that did happen in the 70s and 80s. But that has changed, right? That's changed completely. And right now, there's a sense that it would be wrong for us not to pay them as well as we pay an American or a Chinese or whatever, that they bring a lot to the table to offer, and why deny ourselves the tremendous talent that is out there and is interested in coming back.
Thank you very much. And before I take the last comment, George Reed is asked to report to registration. Mr. Gibbs?
Thank you, Minister. It's a pleasure to have the last question, really. It's a good feeling. When I heard the presentation by Hakeem, I really thought that he was doing a case study of my son, who is currently in South Africa. And what was interesting is that he moved from the frontier of certainty to uncertainty to risk, of which I really couldn't understand it, because when my son could leave Morgan Stanley or Bain and Company and then decide that he was going to enter into the business of setting up educational institutions in South Africa, I almost asked my daughter, who is a psychiatrist, to have a quick word with him. But having visited, I must say, having visited South Africa myself, I can see the vast opportunities for educational services. And he got my endorsement because since I'm about to retire, I asked him if he would give me a little employment. So my question is really, what is the scope for educational services, having regard to the fact that we have an abundance of human resources right here in Barbados?
Thank you very much. Everybody's anxious, so Donna, I'll let you go first.
Yes, I'm all over this one. I've been preaching this for a while. No, in South Africa where we live, yes, as all over Africa. But South Africa in particular, they've come out of practically something like slavery only 20 years ago. And the people who are running that country, they didn't come out of this Kennedy School of Government. They, good, decent people who fought, gave their lives, many of them, family sacrifice and everything to create a free South Africa. They who are running the cabinet, the big, the ministries of everything, they came out of prison. They came out of exile. And so they're, they have all the will in the world. As I say, you see all those disturbances on TV, they're about public services. And education is particularly important because it is the only way, just like how we recognized that a long time ago, that those people, for whom apartheid deprived them of their lives, their youth, their livelihoods, the only way they're going to be part of a new South Africa and benefit from what that means is education. Almost not a single thing else. And so for poor people to not have the education, you have to understand that the people who have been running the public service for 50 years or whatever, and the good things are good. You go to South Africa, you go to Johannesburg, in the main cities, you see the hotels, you see the public buildings, you see the highways. It's like London and New York. The good parts, not the Brixton and so on. And so that exists. So there are two South Africas, and the way to cross over into the other one, to have the gains of what Mandela lived, died, and everything for many others like him is education. And the state, try as it might, because you've got the people who have the good, long-standing careers in the public service, cannot, the white, many Afrikaners and so on, educated and brought up in a certain way cannot deliver education for transformation. This is something that we have to offer, and that people sit up when I tell them about where we are in HDI, about where we are with education literacy. I was hearing it was 98, now I hear it's 99 something. You know, UK does not have that. The UK cannot teach them about education for literacy. Look at where the Black Britons are. What can the UK teach them? So they've been going for technical assistance and getting teachers and so from these places. When I put Barbados on the table, people really sit up and say, you know, we didn't think of that. We were going to go to Coventry. We were creating a new school of government. I said, let's get on the phone. I have Sir Hilary Beckles on speed dial, and let's see how we can make a school of government for transformation that Black people can benefit from in that country. So I am further excited because I'm sitting here, you know, there are 3 Bajans, Ramjit, Ria, there is Damani, he used to be at Bain Capital, and then he told me he was going to open a school, because when you sit there, you see all the opportunities. I am doing one thing, but I have about 3 other businesses that I'm trying to do, because this is the time to do it. And if you have the skills, sometimes it's not always about capital, but you can make ways to bring that together too. But education is something Barbados can certainly fly a big flag for, and it can be the opening of many other professional services and products.
Very, very quickly, in Uganda, for example, there was Makerere University, and then they created Makerere University Business School. And I taught there for the time that I was there simply because Barbadian skills and academic qualifications brought value. And while I was there, I realized that we had Dr. Ralph Gonzalez, who was a graduate of Makerere University. He'd left St. Vincent and gone to Uganda for a master's degree from Makerere University. So there was brand recognition of the quality of education services being offered in the Caribbean. But I want to shift the discussion very slightly to the twinning of technology and information communication technology and the provision of education services by a distance. There is a massive opportunity for us, not just necessarily physically attracting students from the African continent into the Caribbean by virtue of their actual movement. While that is there, and that is a huge opportunity as well, there is the opportunity for us to use our extensive network of telecommunications, to use online sources to provide courses and training facilities and capacities, curriculum development to universities and persons living on the African continent. Here in Barbados, for example, we have the Sridhar Rampal Center for Trade Law and Trade Policy. There are 3 centers like that in the world. The other 2 of them are in Africa. One in Tanzania, Tralac, and in South Africa, in Cape Town, Trapka. They're the only 3, and both of them are modeled very extensively on the Barbados model here at the University of the West Indies. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're there and you're attracting students alone. It means that you have the opportunity to provide capacity building, technical assistance, institutional development, as Donna is here saying, but also to export those services via cross-border means using information and communications technology as well.
Again, just to echo what the last 2 speakers have said, and to echo and confirm, the educational opportunity in Africa is great. It stems from the unfortunate fact that in the last 20 or 30 years, while a lot of new business areas like telecommunications, like banking have taken off, the honest truth about it is that in the areas of education and in the areas of health services, things have, I will not say collapsed, but they have certainly receded. And we do not have as many schools that have maintained the standards over the last 30 or 40 years that a lot of places in the West Indian Islands have done. And I think that there's a lot that can be done there. I'm involved in one educational institution which I'm one of the largest donors. It's a school in South Africa called African Leadership Academy, which you may know about. And it brings together students from all over Africa. And the thinking about it was that students from all over should be educated in a single institution so that they form the friendships and relationships that allow them to work together in the future. And we have half of them on scholarship, half of them fee-paying, and we arrange so that 70 to 80% of them, when they go on to university in the United States, go on full scholarships, and we have succeeded in that. It occurs to me now that really that school should cater for Africa and the West Indies, and that people from the West Indies should come to that school. And so one of the things that I will do right away is to discuss how we get students from here, and how we get teachers from here to be part and parcel of that, because that can only help the strengthening.
Thank you very much, and as much as I would love to continue, we have to bring this to a close. We are running very late, but I would just want to say, as I looked in the room, I saw one a former colleague and one who is unfortunately soon going to join him, and I can offer them to you as resource persons that I'm talking about. Mr. King and Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs is my current PS in foreign trade, and he is about to retire at the end of the year. Mr. King is a former ambassador in PS who has retired, but I can only promise them part of the year because we need them in Barbados still. But I just want to say thank you very much. I believe I can speak for the audience to say that this has been an extremely good panel with a number of key opportunities identified, and certainly we will follow up with your kind offer. As I tell them, when they Google you, they will get to know you a bit more, and that is only part of who you are. Again, welcome to Barbados to you. Welcome home, Donna. And Lisa, thank you very much for coming back and sharing. We will continue later, and I look forward to the other sessions. And again, thank you for being a wonderful audience. Bye-bye.